Okay.
So I so want to rearrange your books into color blocks.
I know that's kind of the trend right now.
Oh,
To rearrange them by color. Yeah, see, there you
oh,
go.
nice.
That's
Nice.
okay. That's interesting. I've never heard of that before, actually.
Oh,
Wow.
I just do
You
it
can
because
see,
it's aesthetically
yeah,
pleasing.
you must
Is
not be
that
watching any of the design shows that I find myself enamored with. Although the book thing, I can't quite get my head around doing that. So
It looks cool. You can't find
yeah,
anything, but it looks cool.
It
is
yeah,
really,
that
absolutely.
kinesthetic? Is that the expression that they use for that,
I
Kirsty?
don't
No,
know, maybe.
that
It just pleases my eye.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, aesthetically pleasing. Yes, that's
Yeah.
the word you're looking for. It's aesthetically pleasing.
that's
But as Christy, you said, you can't find anything once you do that.
But then I don't have as many books as I think as you may have, so I sort of do know where they all are, and I've learned.
Yeah, the shelves go a little further that way and quite a bit further that
Okay.
way. So if I were to do that, I really would be lost. More
Just
than I already
out,
am.
out of curiosity, Kirsty, do they have to follow the rainbow pattern, or is there any particular sequence that they should go in? Or
No, I've just got them in blocks of like white and red and
oh, sorry,
yellow and
okay,
the
I see it now.
oranges and the
Okay,
blues, the blacks.
I've never heard of that. I've never heard of ordering books that way before. But
Martin, that's
cool.
because you're sensible. And I was a librarian growing up, so like it was my
Oh,
Saturday job.
okay.
That's
I've seen
really
people.
amazing. That's really amazing. And dear viewers, you are just watching the chit chat before our show begins. And I'm so pleased to have you all here with us today. And like you see, this is totally a Zoom call with the walls made of glass, right? So you are able to see what we are talking and listen to our conversation, a fireside. And this is Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. I'm glad to be here. I'm Paul Nunes-Diaz, CPA from the IAF and also a PhD, and my co-host, Martin Duffy.
Evening all, Martin Duffy is my name, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Kirsty and Joe, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have a conversation with both of you.
Absolutely, two meeting doctors. And in fact, let me tell you something. I think that the term of meeting doctor, is that correct, Joe Allen? You have it on your LinkedIn.
That's my Twitter handle. That's my Instagram handle. It's on my Facebook. It's my social media. All my social media is organized around this idea of being at meeting doctor. I'm the meeting doctor.
It's such a privilege to have you here on our show today. Joe, thank you so much. And obviously, you're becoming now part of our gallery of meeting doctors as guests. But that, in your case, I mean, it's redundant, right? You're ready. And Kirsty, thank you so much for joining last minute.
That's okay. As I said earlier, you were lucky. My diary was empty. It's 5:30 in the afternoon here in the UK, so it's the end of a working day.
That's the good point. And how was your doctor appointment? Everything's okay?
Dentist, I have nice clean teeth.
Wow.
Very nice. Very good.
Thank you, Joe.
That's awesome. Okay, so we normally begin these conversations by asking you something, right, Martin?
Normally, our opening question, slightly unusual, is there anything that either of you would like to share with us that you normally don't share with people in a public setting?
No, that is okay. So let's be really straight off the bat here, boys. I get an allergic reaction to shitty questions like that.
Okay.
In an icebreaker setting, I think the words icebreaker and energizer in any meeting or workshop should be banned because it just says to me you haven't designed it well. So I'm just going to throw that straight back and not answer the question.
And Kirsty does not usually share that in public, by the way. That is something
I do
shares in
very
private.
happily. Because what you're doing is you're putting people on the spot right away, and their brain feels unsafe.
Yeah. Okay.
And we want to make people feel safe in our meetings and in our workshops. So I'm really sorry, but that question for me, I'd have answered it. But for others, maybe listening and going, God, if you asked me that question in front of 30 people, I'd have freaked out.
Yeah.
It's a hard one. Be aware.
Yeah, that's perfectly fair and perfectly reasonable. Joe, any response or reaction to that?
Well, I already said that Kirsty never usually shares that in public, so she actually did answer the question at the same time as making a critique there. So I applaud you for doing that. I don't know. I mean, it's one of those questions where you almost want to think about it for a minute, because some of the things you wouldn't share in public, there's a reason for it.
Yeah. Well, actually, while you're thinking about that, Joe, I might offer my own one that I don't think I've ever referred to it, which was the comment that you made about the chapter in the book that you co-authored with your fellow colleagues, and that I contributed a chapter to. A number of years ago at this stage. I think it was back, was it 2015 or thereabouts, 2016?
Yeah, so it came out in 2015.
Yeah.
So this is the book for all of your listeners who will want to go out and buy it, of course. Anyway, but chapter 11 is by Martin Duffy and a couple of your colleagues. I forget who they were. Let me make sure I give a nice shout out to them as well. Otherwise, they'll find
the Meeting Doctors Bible.
Brendan O'Rourke.
Yeah, that's right. Brendan was my my supervisor. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll be honest, so much has happened in the last 8 years since that book came out.
Yeah.
That it's a good book. Don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of neat new things. Science of meetings and the practice of meetings, frankly, that is not talked about in there. Still trying to think about the public. Something I don't share in public. Well, actually, no, I have shared this story in public before, and my advisor gets mad at me for it. but I'll share it anyway. So I was in the midst of doing my dissertation. This is quite a few years ago, and I remember, I don't know which version I was on. It was probably like version 25 or something ridiculous, right? And I remember going to my advisor and him asking, "Have you had an English writing class in your adult life?"
He said that to you.
And for those who don't know, Stephen Rogelberg was my advisor. He's written some really great work on meetings. He's who inspired me to started in the area of meeting science. So I know he didn't mean it in a way that to hurt my feelings or anything, but it was something that I've always remembered. I don't share a lot because it is one of those personal things where it's like, yeah, I was really, really terrible at writing. I mean, I really was, and I probably am not that good either still. But I persist, and so I think that's something that I take from that. So
I think isn't that something we all need to do to become good at stuff? It's to persist, because the reason we become good is because we weren't good when we started. So it's but I suppose does that bring us partly to the central question, the idea of face-to-face meetings? Because when Paul and I were setting up this particular episode of our discussions, we were just reflecting on the fact that we've done so much online stuff, we've done so much hybrid stuff, and certainly both of us, when we came back into face-to-face settings after the whole pandemic thing calmed down a little bit, there was certainly a noticeable shift, I think, or change, and I'm not sure why, and we thought maybe it's a worthy discussion just to probe it a little bit and see what some experts might have to say on it. Have we lost that art?
Well, is it back to your earlier point? People are out of practice. And if we're only using our immediate time frame as a reference point, and everything's been on Zoom, MS Teams, or any other virtual format, we've all picked up really bad habits. So I wonder whether then people then find it hard to come back into the in-person.
So there's anecdotal observations. There's also some data, on this to some degree. So anecdotally speaking, I remember going to a conference, the first conference I went to after the lockdowns were done and we were allowed to travel and all those things. I remember going to that conference and just being wiped out. Like, I'd go the day of the conference, I'd been to conferences many, many times before, but I'd never been quite so exhausted at the end of that day. Wow. And I started to think about that. I was like, what's going on? Why am I so exhausted? And it wasn't just because of the COVID-20 that I put on, but it was also because I was out of practice of interacting with people face to face. Now, there are some unique differences, and going to the data, this actually worried me, and so I actually did some data analysis and some data gathering around this to find out how much of the best practices, so to speak, that we use for meetings from face-to-face versus virtual overlap. And about 70% of them overlap, right? So starting on time, ending on time, having an agenda, managing people's, monologues and communication styles and so forth within the, all those things still matter in the virtual and the hybrid and face-to-face. Yeah. But there are some unique properties of the face-to-face meeting and the face-to-face interaction that require certain behaviors. And you mentioned it already. I was out of practice. I know for me, I was exhausted because I was out of practice. And so what the data was suggesting is that people were experiencing a level of fatigue associated with face-to-face meetings that they had forgotten about.
Yeah.
Right? Wow. They knew about Zoom fatigue, and that was a new thing because the camera was producing some interesting situations and experiences. But then we had this interpersonal interaction fatigue that was we just got out of practice. And I've since gone to future conferences and I'm not nearly as exhausted. And it's because of those skills, those muscles, whatever you want to call them, brain muscles and physical muscles, kind of started to, get the strength back that they had before. And so I wasn't quite as exhausted. So I think there's some truth to that, idea that in person does have some unique properties to it.
Yeah. And I can concur. I don't have the data, Joe, but talking with facilitators and trainers who went back to in-person workshops and just having chats, and people were just like, oh my God, it's exhausting. It's like, I forgot how hard it is. And then there was a lot of joking around that some of us would often do 3-4 days back to back in a week and think nothing of it. And then suddenly people are like, no way am I doing that. And add into that sometimes travel between locations. In the UK, it's often by car, but you add in another country. And we were all like, yeah, it's like this reflective muscle hadn't been exercised for a considerable amount of time.
Yeah.
And what does that have to do? I'm trying to kind of extrapolate that into the virtual meeting settings. And this thing about have cameras on or cameras off, the ability to mute the microphone, shut the camera off, and that gives you respite. That gives you a pause. It gives you a time to just, I don't know, feed the cat or put out the dog or do something, which we can't do if we're in the. Is that part of it, or is there more? Joe, you said there's 30%.
70% overlap between the two in terms of best practices. Well, you've identified the biggest difference, right? Which is the technology, right? Yeah. And the features and the challenges that introduces, right? Because there's both the good things, which is I can pause when someone says something that I'm really not happy about. I can pause my camera, I can mute my thing, and I can scream out loud, and no one's going to know except for maybe my neighbors, right? And so you can actually have those moments of release, and no one's going to call you out because we've kind of gotten used to the interactions and knowing that some people are going to have to step away for a second. They've got, maybe they got kids, maybe they got pets, maybe they got any number of reasonable reasons. And we can use those reasonable reasons to also do the more reflective, filtering, et cetera, that we might need to do in meetings that are more complex or complicated. So, but one thing I did want to ask about is, the title of this is about have we lost the art of face-to-face meeting. My concern is that I'm not sure we ever had the art.
Joe, I was thinking exactly the same when I saw the question. I was like, what even made us think that people had the art in the first place? Sorry if you're a listener to this, but
right.
I don't think we have all been schooled well. So I think it's a great nudge, Joe. Yeah. I'm with you.
Yeah, I mean, because I did a survey a while ago and asked these were MBA students, so take that for what it's worth, a Master of Business Administration, and many of them had studied business as an undergraduate. Many were studying as master's students for the MBA, and I asked them the question, have you taken a class on effective communication? Have you taken a class on meetings? Have you taken a class on facilitation? Any of those topics? Less than 10% of people in this sample indicated that they'd actually had formal training around how to have a good meeting, and that's reflected in how poor our meetings are. I mean, we expect these people to go lead and manage organizations. We don't even train them on how to do it.
Yeah. That's really interesting for an MBA. You think they probably think it's far too obvious or it's far too basic. Yeah, it would make I'm sure you've got the data, Joe. The number of hours of people's lives wasted in a meeting because there was no clear purpose or outcome defined. Or the amount of frustration that can be generated poorly managed meeting.
So maybe our question is misplaced. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about losing the art of face-to-face. Maybe we should be talking about what is the art of face-to-face that we're all missing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a more worthy point of conversation around this thing?
I mean, perhaps. I mean, when 51% of our meetings are rated as poor, I think there's a reason to believe that there's some art to it that we are not, for the most part, embracing it. And I'll include myself in this. I'm not good at following my own advice all the time. I need to improve as well. But the reality is, I think the vast majority of people don't actually run meetings all that effectively.
It's because they're not taught.
Yeah, they're not taught. And we don't hold them to any expectations. When's the last time you were evaluated for your performance in your organization on whether or not you ran an effective meeting? And yet we spend 75% of our time in them.
And no one calls out poor behavior, and everyone looks to another and sort of like the pointing of fingers going, well, it's your responsibility. Yours. You're the leader. Yeah, but you called the meeting. You're like, come on, just take ownership. There's some real basics that you can implement that just make it meaningful for us all.
Yeah.
So is this a problem that colleges need to address? Is it a problem that businesses need to address? Or is it a bit of both?
Probably.
Well, go ahead, Christy.
I was going to say, Joe, in the UK, from a college perspective, a lot of us finish our higher education with like a BSc or a BA. We don't go on and do the second degree, which I think, forgive me if I'm wrong, is quite lauded in America. So getting your MBA is a thing to do. Whereas in the UK, again, I don't know what the stat is. I guess it will be smaller. And a lot of people who do MBAs have often been in business and start it around 30, 35 rather than straight out of first degree. So I did a geography degree, and there'll be people I work with who did an English degree or a science degree, and then we went into business. So I would say from a UK perspective, I wouldn't, and it might have really changed now. Let's be really clear. I'm out of uni by 30 years. So it may have changed since then, but I don't think UK colleges, universities would teach people that. So I don't know what the difference is.
Yeah, I mean, I know US-based colleges don't teach that at the undergraduate level unless you take, unless you're a communication studies major. I mean, you're gonna learn things there, but unless you're specifically in a major that's really about it, or about communication, about interaction, even majors that should teach it, like business, no, it doesn't exist there. Does it need to be addressed by educators? Yeah, probably. But the problem is organizations aren't demanding it, right? Yeah. Organizations haven't said this is a problem. Or at least they haven't said it loud enough and with enough fervor and tied it to bottom line indicators, other things of that nature to say this is a problem we want fixed. Because the issue is they don't. I mean, they haven't asked for that. They don't evaluate people, as I said before, on performance appraisal tools around this. So if we don't expect people to do better with meetings, and organizations don't expect their people to be trained with meetings, then educators aren't going to educate people to do it, and businesses aren't going to train people to do it. And so we're going to waller in our mess of meetings for as long as we guess we want to.
and the answer probably is, Joe, there's a couple of things that go through my head as I hear you speak, is they don't know what they don't know. And at the moment, obviously the way they're running their meetings isn't causing enough pain to go, oh, I want to do something different. They're just getting through, I would surmise. They're sort of, or the people that are noticing it's painful are maybe too junior in the organization and don't feel like they have a voice to call it out to their senior leaders. I don't know.
Yeah.
That would be a...
Well, there's also the concept of the meeting leader blind spot, right? Yeah. This is, my meetings are great. It's those people over there that are terrible, right? So it's not convincing people that they need help it's
convincing other people,
right? Rather than, that's why when I wrote the book, Running Effective Meetings for Dummies, I jokingly, but only sort of jokingly said, hey, this is a good gag gift for your boss. Right. And I said it that way because most of the time, no self-respecting boss, no self-respecting individual is going to buy that book and let people know that they bought it, because everyone thinks they're doing great at their meetings, and they think everybody else is stinking at it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to share an anecdote against myself on exactly that point, Joe. So many years ago at this stage, more than 10 years ago at this stage, I took over a role where I had 9 facilitators in a team. We were working across 14 different organizations. And I was the national coordinator for this group in an Irish educational context. And as we worked for the first 6 months together, we met once per month for 1 day because we had to share across these organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And we progressively got worse and worse and worse in our meetings. And I was looking at this progression, and after about 3-4 months, I was kind of going, I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Like, we stuck to time, we did all this standard stuff, and it just wasn't making sense to me. And I got to a frustrating point where I said, okay, guys, we need to fix this, because I don't know why it's going wrong, but it's going wrong and we need to stop it. So I phoned everybody individually. I said, guys, is it me? Is it you? Is it us? What is it? And at the next meeting, 2 things changed. One, we started to talk about it. We started to talk about the performance of the meeting itself. The second thing that changed was, I said, I'm only chairing this by default. I said, I don't particularly want to, and I don't particularly have to. So I said, if we can change that, I'm happy to change that. So we introduced rotating chairs from a panel of the 9 of us who was willing to chair it. So we had 5 out of the 9. We started to rotate chairs, and instantly all of the meeting performances for the next 3 years started a significant upward trend.
Interesting. I'm really curious about your language of chairing, because as soon as I hear the language of chair, that creates certain I would hear certain behaviors of the chair, and it feels incredibly formal. And I'm more curious about the language of meeting host, or some companies might choose a facilitator. I don't, and I'm just curious what the language of chair does for the rest of us.
That's a really interesting point, because it certainly plants a seed in people's minds and expectations. I would absolutely agree there, Kirsty.
It feels very formal.
It's a lovely observation, Kirsty, because in my part of the world, I'm talking in Southern Europe, you know, there's not that cultural background that you folks have in Northern Europe and Anglo-Saxon countries, and of course, US as the culprit of the Anglo-Saxonic culture. It's we don't have that notion of sharing meetings.
Yeah, that's interesting. What would you say instead, Paul? What language would you use?
We have a boss who runs the meeting, and the employees just listen.
Wow.
Yeah.
How about you, Joe?
I think we hear the term host, we hear the term chair. In academia, there's lots of chairs of committees, and so they run the meetings, right? Then you have meeting leaders, which are often the boss, but don't have to be. They're like the project leader potential thing. And so the role that and the label we put on it does matter in terms of the formality, the structure, the expectations, the responsibility or not in making sure the meeting goes well and so forth. I think one thing I did want to bring up, Martin, is that one of the reasons why what you did worked is because you collaboratively set ground rules and decided and divided up the roles and said, hey, this person's going to facilitate or host or lead or what, going to chair this meeting, and that's going to rotate. You because you set those expectations and set the ground rules, people then line and started to enact those according to what their understanding of what they meant. And over time, that even got better because people started to understand what they meant by those rules, and by doing, they also learned what that meant to do. And so I think that's something that I often teach organizations who do want to improve their meetings is if you want your meetings to change, you have to convince people that they should do that. And in order to convince them to do that, they have to collaboratively decided that's important to them as a team or a group or a division or whatever. And then once they collectively have decided that and identified the rules and policies or whatever you want to call them, follow, then you can start to see, okay, this is what we said we're going to do. How are we doing on that? And you can kind of hold people to those things. Oh, you're the chair this month. Oh, I forgot. Oh, I'm so sorry. You know, you have that. You can see people will start to govern each other, you know, help each other, you know, recognize that they have responsibilities or don't, you know, over a given thing. So I think that's to me, I think was kind of a big turning point for in the story that you shared about how to change that paradigm for you guys.
And I think it's as well, Joe, it's the fact that the role of the host, chair, lead has been defined.
Yeah.
And I wonder again, so it's not about necessarily, we haven't talked about structure yet of a good meeting, but the fact that the role has been defined helps people because again, by default, you're the boss, you run the meeting. Well, what does that mean? Am I in my boss hat? Am I in my leader hat?
Yeah.
But actually what I need to put on is my meeting leader hat, which is fundamentally, we know, different to be a leader in the business, a manager, the boss, because you need to get out of the way of the group to let them have the conversation. Right. But they don't.
Just observationally, one of the things that I remember observing critically in the 6 months after we made that change in that, my role as the boss of the group improved significantly because I actually now had time and capacity at the meetings to listen, to absorb, to engage in a completely different way to what the chair role required me to do. But the participants, all of the others, improved because they had to take on the chair at some stage. And they learned from that what it's like to have somebody who's not a good participant at the meeting. If you're in the chair and there's people who are a bit tricky, a bit difficult, a bit awkward, so then they slowly became less tricky, less difficult, less awkward, because they could empathize having sat in the chair for one term. So there were two key observations that I found. So I always advise clients, I say, because you're the boss, you don't have to be the chair. You might be a better boss for not being the chair, and others might benefit from learning what it's like to be in the chair.
Run the meeting.
Yeah. Nice. Would you identify with that, or was that unique to me and the particular group I was working with?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, so I think it's a good way to give people experiences. I think organizations who and groups and teams who figure out that they need to work on their meetings will first hopefully set some ground rules and start to see some differences, some improvements, and some changes. And then they'll start to hope that their other meetings can be that way. And then you'll see a propagation of that sort of behavior elsewhere. And then there's also that fact that organizations really should think about succession planning, right? So if you're a boss and you lead most of the meetings for your team, at some point, I would imagine you'll want to be promoted or move to another role, right? Well, someone's going to be left behind who needs to be able to run meetings, right? So again, as you things out, having that rotating that responsibility around, and that's why I mentioned earlier, a project leader may not be the boss, but they should be leading the meetings over their project, right? And so that gives them the opportunity to have some responsibility and demonstrate that. And from a succession planning perspective, it allows them to develop skills that might be necessary if they were to be promoted or to move to another job where they do have that responsibility for more of their meetings.
Agree.
But Joe, don't you think that if you have this vision of having a project manager to be appointed as the one who is going to run the meeting, wouldn't that be throwing someone to the lion's circus without proper training?
Yeah, but Paul, it happens to all of us. We're asked to suddenly run a meeting at a junior level. So the project managers need to suck it up and learn. So it happens to all of us. And then if you work in a good organization and you're asked to suddenly run a meeting for the first time, I really hope that you go and find your boss or someone who you go, can you help me? What should I do? How do I approach this? What do I need to consider? How do I plan it out? What's the use of my time? You know,
Yeah,
you're being very loving and kind, but you gotta
Krista's
learn.
exactly right. It happens to all get kind of thrown to the lions. In most, I mean, that's been my experience in every organization that I've worked in or worked with or for or anything of that sort. I don't think it has to be that way though, Paul.
No.
Right? I think that's the issue here. That if an organization were to actually adopt some training around this or demonstrate good, effective meeting leadership, right, and then ask someone to lead a meeting, then they've got an example that they would follow, because they're going to follow the example regardless, right? So if the boss leads it this way, they're going to lead it that way, right?
So I've got a question for you. So I'm guessing, and this is for all of us, we're asked to go into client meetings ourselves, and we work with the clients. And it might be virtual, it might be in person. How often do you step in to lead the meeting? Because how often do you step forward to lead the meeting? Especially if it's a two-way meeting between you and it's like just you and the client.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things where it depends on how what happens leading up to the meeting, right? If they provide an agenda and I can see, you know, if they're following good practices in the what I call the not the infrastructure, the scaffolding, the meeting scaffolding ahead of time, right? If they put in place that I think will make it a more effective meeting, then I'm less likely to kind of jump in there. But if all it is hey, one-on-one with Joe about meetings, then I'm going to come prepared for that meeting. And if it's clear pretty quickly that they don't have a clue who they're talking to or what they're talking about, I'll jump in and try and facilitate an effective interaction to help them know what I am, what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it kind of depends on where they are in their development in terms of meeting.
How about you, Martin?
Yeah, I'd probably 50, Kirsty, on the basis that the defining point for me is what's the intended outcome of the meeting. So if the people that I'm meeting with are really clear on that, there's a very high chance that they'll have put something in place to deliver that output in the time that they want that output. But the other 50%, I'll have built a sense from initial interactions where they're fuzzy on the outcome, in which case I revert then into Joe's mode. So I go into my mode of saying, what's the outcome that I want from this encounter? And then I'll do my preparation focused on my outcome. And where necessary, I'll push and shove both pre-meeting and then agenda setting, and then during meeting. I'll try to do it in the most diplomatic way that I can, but I'll make sure that I'm walking away either satisfied that I'm clear on what they want, or I'm satisfied these are people that I actually don't want to work with.
Yeah.
One of the two.
One of the two. How about you, Paul?
I refrain a lot to intervene, and this was an interesting story, because when I was doing my first attempt to become a CIT in Geneva, 2014, I was listening to this amazing story from a colleague from India, and he was facilitating a meeting with the boss, the meeting owner, just next to him, and suddenly the meeting became so chaotic, everybody talking, and then when he was about to intervene and say, hey, we must stop it, he happened to look at the boss, and the boss was great. So that's a funny story, but it's sometimes when we see chaos and we see this our urge to intervene, maybe it's not that necessary. Let the meeting flow.
Yeah. I think it's, for me, even if, you know, the client goes, we need to have an update, we need to have a one-on-one, I'm like, yeah, absolutely cool with that. And to your point, I don't see the scaffolding coming in the invite. I just see a link. I don't see why are we gathering, what are the outcomes I'm seeking to achieve in this conversation. We've got an hour, let's talk about it, or I want to show you something on the set of slides. I'm looking for that. So when I don't see that arriving, other than the MS Teams or the Zoom link, And then the client just jumps straight into solution mode. I often go, can we just dial it back a little bit? And then I'm always curious, like, so what do you want to achieve in the next hour? What will make this meeting a success for you? And then that's when they all pause and go, oh yeah, okay. And then that's when I go around the room. Say there were 4 of us, I'd go around each of you and go, what is it that will make this meeting a success for you? Because then we all know what the other needs. And I don't always see that happening.
Yeah.
And that for me, I just think helps all of us then move forward together in that 1 hour. Because we know how, and sometimes it's even saying there's a lot there. Is that a realistic achievement in 1 hour? And then you can see people's brains ticking about that as well. I don't know, I just get quite pedantic. Yeah, my team will tell you, they've seen me do it. I'm like, let's just bring this back. What do you want to achieve?
No, but then I suppose doesn't that Kirsty, doesn't that take you into agenda setting, agenda culling?
But we can do it collaboratively together, and everyone then goes, okay. And then it gives me permission often to go, we're running out of time, or you've got half an hour left. Do you want to go off in this direction now? I don't know, Joe, how that works from your perspective, because you've done the research.
Yeah, I mean, every meeting needs to have a purpose, right? And that purpose should be known by everybody going into the meeting, right? And that's the problem. Too often we go to meetings and there is no purpose. And so if I don't see a purpose on the invite, I kind of annoy my colleagues sometimes. I'm like, so why are we meeting? I ask them. I point blank say, hey, thank you for adding it to my calendar. Why are we meeting? And if they can't come back with an answer, or they're afraid to give that answer to me via email or through, or call me up or whatever, then I cancel the meeting, or I don't go to the meeting, because I'm not going to meet. I can't prepare for something I don't even know what's going on.
I agree.
And so, but that's one issue. But the other issue is standing meetings, right? We have these standing meetings we go to every week that have a standing agenda, right? And the purpose and the goals and the aims of those meetings sometimes gets a little stale, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to sometimes go in there and refresh those a little bit and say, hey, are we doing this every week?
Yeah.
Right? What's our goal here? What is our purpose? That sort of thing. Because too many meetings on our schedules just are there.
Yeah, right.
and don't need to be there, right? So
I agree, Joe. I used to work for Diageo. I feel really lucky that I had a lot of schooling working at Diageo, and it must have been about 2001, and they re-looked at their meeting culture, and something called the POST was introduced. So the POST stands for purpose, outcome, structure, time. And it's something that stuck with me forever, because if you were to set up a meeting, in the meeting invite, you had to clearly write, why are we joining together today? What are the outcomes we're seeking to achieve? How structure is that going to flow? Like, what are your intent? And then how much time have you put to one side for that meeting? And there were sort of stories flying around at that time that the senior directors would reject meeting invites if there was no clear post. And then we would tap into the post at the very beginning of each meeting as well, and just be really clear why we're here. Are you all in the right room? Sort of mentality. And this is how it's going to work. And that stuck with me for over 20 years. So I still use it in all my invites and meetings. It's a easy mnemonic to remember as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that.
And I'd love to know who created it. And I was thinking just today, I was like, who created that? So if anyone listening knows, can someone tell me?
Absolutely. I'm wondering if you guys know more about also the military. They have an interesting way to organize information. And have you got some tips from the military, Kirsty and Joe?
No, I've never worked with the military.
So I've worked with military and paramilitary, like firefighters and police officers, that sort of thing, quite a bit, but mostly focused on a specific type of meeting: the after action review, debrief, hot wash, whatever word they use to describe it. But things have happened, good, bad, or otherwise. Reviewing the behaviors, reviewing what went well, what didn't go well, identifying what they would do differently under similar circumstances or under a similar process.
That's a good meeting though, Joe. And I think maybe how many businesses do the review meeting?
Yeah,
not as many as probably ought to. Right. I mean, the area of business that has really started adopting this beyond, the firefighters and the police officers and high reliability organizations like that, is actually software companies.
Yeah.
Because Agile actually has the retrospective, right? Well, that's borrowed from military. That's where they got that.
Okay.
So yeah, and so the retrospective is really useful and should be used by more than just software developing organizations.
Do you have any anecdotes as to why businesses don't do the retrospective?
I mean, a lot of things that we said already explain why people don't adopt good meeting practices, like doing a good type of meeting, right?
Yeah.
But I don't have a good answer for that as to why it hasn't been deployed. I think too often people don't know that they could do it. I think often people think that a debrief has to happen after an event. Well, no, it can happen after any activity, any process, anything in your organization. You can do a retrospective on.
Yeah,
right? You can do a debrief on. You can do that, and so I think we often maybe overlook it as an option. I don't know.
I think
other than anecdotes, I don't have a good answer to that.
Well, my anecdote would be, this is a felt. I'm very felt sense. So I would also hypothesize that people don't want to look backwards because they've got to maybe face into what didn't go well, and as a human, people don't like to do that. And to name it, which is a shame. And there's a whole other school of thought around that, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean that's psychologically speaking, that's evaluation apprehension. We all have it. We all hate it. We don't like to be from childhood all the way up. We don't like tests. We don't like to be evaluated to find out whether we did well or not. And so reflecting on it is pretty difficult. And that's why a lot of consulting groups and consulting firms don't do the post implementation review. They don't do it at all. And the reason they don't want to do it is because their stuff may not work. And if it didn't, why would we want to know
your language?
I want to keep getting paid. So.
Well, and from the world I come from as well, Joe, like learning, and we sometimes do projects that last 6 months, or you do programs that last a year. We definitely need to get better. This is me being very transparent. We need to get better at doing the post review. But I think you've just given me some language about the apprehension. What's going to be said about the business? What's going to be said about, and it is, and I can feel it as you say.
Yeah, it makes you nervous. You're like, oh, what if I'm doing bad, right?
Yeah,
really even
but
know
actually,
it.
what if we're doing great?
Right? And so that's the focus. You have to remind people, hey, you talk about what went right first.
Yes.
And then you talk about what what went wrong, or what almost went wrong, or what could be done better.
Yeah.
And everybody needs to get better. I mean, but it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to do
and
that.
It's getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. Have you ever run something? I know Miriam Hadness has been on here before, but she taught me the language of a pre-mortem, which I quite like. So, like, as you're going into a big project or a big planning for something, do a meeting that's purely about what could possibly go wrong. Let's just blow it up that way.
Yeah, I have heard that. I've heard her talk about that. I think there's, again, it goes back to, if the meeting has a purpose and and you identify it ahead of time, it can be really effective at doing what you want to do. The meeting is just an amazing and adaptable feature that if you used it right, you can do really great things, like the pre-mortem. I think that's a great potential type of meeting that could be deployed in a lot of different organizations for a lot of different reasons, but is often not done that way. So.
Could I just make 2 observations on what you've just spoken about there? On the military side, I served for 15 years, and in the flying, and one of the practices, and this was just habitual practice. Nobody ever asked, why are we doing this? But after every flight, every single flight, you always reviewed the flight with whoever was on the flight with you. It's just a standard thing. It might only be informal. It might just be a chat about something that happened 20 minutes ago, but it's an ingrained cultural thing. So that might partly explain why military tends to do that a little bit more intuitively. Aviation military, ground military, I suspect they might suffer from that evaluation apprehension, Joe, that you mentioned, more than most. But in aviation, you actively look to critically review, because it might just save your bacon the next time. So that's the first point. But the second thing that I pick up, actually, so Edward de Bono, I'm sure both of you have probably heard of him. he developed the concept of plus minus interesting, PMI.
Hmm.
And ways back 20 years ago, when I started facilitating meetings for the first time, a colleague introduced me to PMI, and we started to use PMI at the end of every workshop that we ran.
Hmm.
So we ran a plus minus interesting segment for 3 minutes. 1 minute was positive. Everything that was positive about the meeting, about the workshop, about the event, let's just rattle them off. Brainstorm, no interruptions, no discussion, no debates, just fire it out. Anything that was negative, fire it out. And the third one, the interesting, was, well, if it's neither of those two, but just something that interesting that came up.
Nice.
And when you do that with a group, and I've done this with every group that I've since then, when you do it with a group over time, you start to build a resource for the group to say, have we been consistently doing this thing that's good? Well, let's keep doing it because it's good.
Yeah.
Consistently bad, guys, we really need to work on this. And interesting, well, we just don't know what's going to come of it, but something interesting might come out of the interesting stuff.
Nice.
And the most recent group that I've worked with was a group of 8 mid-level managers. We're just going to have our final workshop on the 30th of this month. We've reviewed it with a PMI at the very end. The final workshop is going to be a meeting with this group of 8 and their executive management team. So it's the mid-managers meeting the top management team in a half-a-day workshop. And the group have asked if we can do a PMI at the end of that workshop. And I said, yes. Mm-hmm. So they have come to see the power of just doing a 3-minute plus minus interesting. It's semi-structured. We know what the words mean. We're disciplined now because I discipline them. I won't let the chatter go on. And at the end of it, they now have a resource they look back to see, well, what came out of a meeting 4 meetings ago or a workshop 4 weeks ago that we might now want to use in our next workshop with the executive management team.
Nice.
And that's a unique way to use it as a resource over time, which I hadn't actually seen used before, but this group have adopted it for themselves.
Lovely.
Absolutely. Martin, I think we are reaching out our time. Our viewers will be eager to stay with us for another hour or so, but I'm sure we have plenty of stuff to do after this cup of coffee, watching us on LinkedIn or on our social media channels where we are showing this interesting conversation so far. So what have we learned about the art of hosting face-to-face meetings so far? And the wrap up on the program today.
What a whirlwind. Where would I start? We need to get AI to do the analysis, Paul.
There you go. That too.
let me have a crack at it. We started by suggesting, Kirsty, you pitched in first saying maybe we're out of practice with the face-to-face meetings. What we discovered was that the virtual meetings that we attended, particularly during the pandemic, probably gave all of us a degree of respite that allowed us to switch off cameras, switch off microphones, take a pause, step back, scream at the camera without anybody knowing that we were screaming. And we had to rehabituate ourselves back into face-to-face. But then we very quickly changed tack. We said, do we actually have face-to-face expertise in meetings? And that brought us onto a completely different track and a really interesting track. So a couple of things that came out of that. We basically talked about meeting leadership, meeting management, and we used our own personal anecdotes and so on to explore the idea that just because you're the leader doesn't mean you have to be the chair. If you are going to be the chair, are we presupposing a particular type of meeting? And does that cover all possible types of meetings? And I think we pretty much agreed, well, actually, it does presuppose and we have to chair every meeting, but we have to manage our meetings. So that brought us into the whole area of preparation for meetings, pre-planning for meetings, the importance of setting the outcome before we ever get into the beginning of the meeting. So we explored that a little bit. Kirsty, you took us into the purpose, the outcome, the structure, and the time, POST, as a simple but really illuminating acronym for if you answer those 4 key questions in preparation, there's a very, very good chance that you're going to have the right people, the right time, and you're going to have the right. We then talked a little bit about post-action reviews. We drifted into the military a little bit. We talked about aviation, which I brought in because that's my own personal professional background. We talked about evaluation apprehension as a possible reason why many organizations don't seem to reflect on their meetings. And we very briefly explored why that might be. And I suggested an idea that Edward de Bono actually came up with, which is the use of plus minus interesting as a really simple tool, a bit like POST in preparing for meetings. Well, maybe we can have a PMI at the meeting to evaluate in a safe way, but in a slightly self-critical way. Critical positive, critical negative, but equally critical, did anything interesting come up? We then segued, we did a major left turn, I think was the way you called it, Joe. And we started to talk about AI. And I'm certain we could be here for another 3 or 4 hours talking in the direction that we had started to go. But I leave it at that. I hope that's a reasonably faithful and quick summary of some of the key points that we managed about in a really interesting discussion.
Absolutely, Martin. Thank you so much for summarizing this. We'll compare now with our AI note taker and we'll judge. Everybody in this meeting will be able to judge that. So final word, golden nugget. Kirsty, Joe, what do you have to share with our viewers here on LinkedIn? Perhaps they will be looking for you guys as meeting doctors to help them on their meetings. Can I have a golden nugget from both of you to close these today?
I think Joe's taught me something about me, which is evaluation apprehension. So thank you, Joe. That was, you've named something for me. And I was like, oh yeah, I recognize that.
Yeah. And Kirsty, thank you for POST, because that was a great acronym that speaks it's very similar to the two questions I always tell people to ask themselves when they're about to schedule a meeting. One, does the meeting have a purpose? If say yes, ask the second question, which is, does that meeting require collaboration? Or does that purpose require collaboration? If you say yes to both of those, proceed to schedule your meeting. If you say no to either one, stop it.
Yeah.
You probably don't need a meeting.
Love it.
Okay, guys, so this is about it. That I hope that you enjoy the program with us today, and please stay with us, as next month we're going to expand on this conversation and bringing AI into the field. That's all for now, and thank you so much for watching.